Okay, let us try a new way of filming. I don't know if the sound records. I don't know what it's gonna be like, but let's try. Do we see? Yeah. I don't know if the sound is gonna be okay. I still have improvements to do on the technical formal aspect, but I intended to record a video. Here we are, the 28th of August 2023. I haven't recorded a video in a while, and I have no no structured plan. I don't know what I'm going to talk about exactly, but I know the broad topics. I intend to talk about the Enlightenment, Romanticism, Nietzsche, and Christianity. I've had interesting thoughts this morning, very early when I woke up, and I just want to make a normal talk because I've had. Actually, I've been reading. I started to read thoroughly this book by Mr. Pinker, Enlightenment Now: The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress, and it made me think about a few ideas that I've had for many years that I have already expressed variously, but that I keep refining on myself. So it's an improvised talk about these four topics: Nietzsche, the Enlightenment, Romanticism, and Christianity. I just bought a statue recently. That's David from Michelangelo. Yeah. And yeah. I will just go pick up a book. we see Transcendentalism collection. Yeah, we see. Maybe it's too brilliant, I don't know. Yeah, that's the first time that I've been using this camera because I had some technical issues. But yeah, so I was reading Mr. Pinker and I was thinking about Christianity. I've been watching videos about American Christians turning towards atheism. And I was thinking about Nietzsche and Romanticism. So I speak off the cuff, as they call this. I will just express some thoughts. So, the Enlightenment. Usually it's considered to be the 18th century, especially the second half, or approximately between 1725 and 1775 broadly, or even later, actually no, from 17, the first quarter, or the early couple of decades of the 18th century was still, from an ideological standpoint, in the continuity of the 17th century. But then with the earliest thinkers, the spread of Newton, Voltaire, Montesquieu, then David Hume in the middle of the century. Then, so the first couple of decades of the 18th century, as far as I know, this was in the continuity of the 17th century in terms of ideology among the intellectual elites, but then there was a shift at the beginning of the 18th century, and it lasted up until the later decades of the century, and the pinnacle in terms of intellect was probably Kant, the major works of Kant. As far as I know, Die Kritik der reinen Vernunft, it's 1781 for the first edition, and then there was a second edition, and then the second and third critiques, critique of practical reason and critique of judgment, of the faculty of judgment, yeah. And Adam Smith, in a way, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, which was inspired by the French intellectuals, which were intellectually diverse, but they all agreed on fundamental views on the church, the role of the church, the criticism of absolute monarchy, doubts about metaphysics, and most of them had Anglo-Saxon ideas from Locke, Newton, etc., etc. Yeah, so yeah, and Romanticism, I approximately began in the latest decade of the 18th century, and it thrived for the first few decades of the 19th century. It's often believed that Jean-Jacques Rousseau, was both an Enlightenment thinker, but actually was an anti-Enlightenment thinker. So he's considered to be the ideological founder of Romanticism, at least the premises, and then it was taken over and developed by the Germans, Novalis, the Schlegel brothers, partly Schelling. Then it thrived in England in the early decades of the 19th century, and in France later with Coleridge, Byron, Wordsworth, and in France that was Victor Hugo, Lamartine, etc., etc., plus the great painters, the musician with Beethoven partly, etc., etc., and the painters, etc., etc. Walter Scott, I'm not sure that he's considered to be a romantic, but yeah. Yeah. So the Enlightenment, yeah. The 3/4 of the 18th century, and Romanticism, it partly it was a reaction, a dialectical reaction against the Enlightenment, and it broke off, symbolic in the realm of philosophy. Romanticism was a reaction against Kant, namely the philosophy of Schelling, and then Novalis, etc., etc. Yeah, and I was thinking about this by reading Mr. Pinker. In my view, there has been, throughout the history of Western civilization and European culture, some sort of an ongoing conflict, but a prolific, fertile, productive conflict, or if not conflict, at least a tension within the cultural expressions of the European soul, one might say, which has taken also political, religious, sometimes philosophical, cultural forms, but here I'm talking about art and the manifestations in art, between what Nietzsche would call the Apollonian principle and the Dionysian, Apollo and Dionysos. We found this already in ancient Greece, in classical Greek culture, the 5th century BCE, and even partly before and after, but the classical age was kind of an age of clarity, measure, balance, beauty, order, etc., etc. It was the dominant principle, the classical Athens. But precisely Nietzsche tried to rehabilitate the Dionysian principle, which is more the spontaneous instincts rather than the dry reason. That's how he could formulate it. But actually this polarity, in a way, has existed or has manifested itself throughout European history. And another example is during the Renaissance. Here, the categories, they are retroactively or retrospectively applied. They do not make any sense from a strictly cultural, aesthetic perspective, but it's just to simplify. But the Renaissance was kind of romantic in a sense that it was partly a rediscovery. Here I project backward the categories of the 19th century in terms of aesthetics, culture, onto the 16th century, when I say so. It doesn't make any sense from a really rigorous standpoint, but it's just to try to clarify. But the interest for the mystical, the occult, but also an outburst of creativity. We found this in the Renaissance, which gave birth to the classical age, the 17th century, which would be a precursor of the Enlightenment, and in a way it is, but also a kind of the Apollonian principle, at least in a country like France, where really it was rigor, geometrical shapes, balance, measure, artistic expressions, drawing heavily in terms of inspiration from precisely ancient Greece and classical Roman culture, etc. So it was the principle of clarity, order, measure, balance, reason, rationality, etc. Not only in philosophy, but also in literature, aesthetics, architecture, art, etc., etc. Then there was the Barocco counter-revolution, which was partly a reaction against the Protestant Reformation. The Catholic Church tried to seduce it's partly that, but it tried to seduce the followers by promoting a form of art which was more appealing in a way. So the Barocco is kind of opposed to the classical ideal, and in the 18th and 19th century we have this kind of opposition, that which Nietzsche would call Apollonian and Dionysian, which can be, depending on the category, called the Enlightenment values or ideals versus Romantic ideals. So that's precisely what we will have in the 18th century. Every time that Europeans have an outburst of clarity, reason, rationality, measure, balance, order, structure, light, etc., there is the Dionysian romantic aspect, which manifests itself as a reaction, which is more in the realm of feelings, imagination, a little bit passion and excesses, the vital instincts in a way, which try to shake the attempt to order and to structure and to tame, one might say, through rationality, the creative expression and the artistic expression of Europeans. It has been a recurrent feature throughout Western history. And the Enlightenment, I was thinking about this. The Enlightenment, by reading the names that I know vaguely, I mean, I know the names, but I vaguely know the works and the ideas, not in a thorough way, but I know them vaguely. The name of the Enlightenment, Voltaire, Montesquieu, David Hume, Adam Smith, Kant, these are in various fields. Then the French materialist, or not necessarily materialist, but Enlightenment thinkers, or the encyclopedists like Diderot, d'Alembert, some French intellectuals like D'Holbach, Lamétrie, Condorcet, etc., etc. Rousseau, which is very different, but he's also a French-speaking Enlightenment thinker, although he was anti-Enlightenment, while being a revolutionary nonetheless, intellectually. Yeah, so these thinkers, and then Giambattista Vico, Adam Smith, or listed David Hume, etc., etc. So, yeah, these thinkers, whether these are moralists like Adam Smith, or economists like Adam Smith as well, or moralists and philosophers and epistemologists like David Hume, or writers, lawyers, or people interested in law like Montesquieu, which was also a great writer, or intellectuals like Voltaire, or critical thinkers like Kant. In a way, of course, they are very interesting to read, and they have interesting things to say, but they are not really very exciting. They are, most of the time, they are very intelligent. Montesquieu writes very well and says very intelligent things. Kant, it's not necessarily very pleasant to read, but Kant is very intelligent. It's very interesting to read, but it's a little bit dry and boring, like the Germans sometimes. And Adam Smith, it contains a lot of interesting insights, but it's not fascinating as such to read about economics. Yeah, so the Enlightenment, it's, in a way, it's a form of light and clarity and intelligence, in a way, but it's not very appealing from an emotional standpoint. And the thesis of Mr. Pinker basically is that the ideals of the Enlightenment have succeeded reason, science, humanism, and progress, which is true. The results have been astonishing, exceptional. That's what the book talks about, but actually we live in the successful utopia of the Enlightenment thinkers, not just Europeans, but the whole world actually. The population has been multiplied eightfold. The standards of living, life expectancy, access to hygiene, healthcare, wealth, opportunities has improved tremendously over the past couple of centuries as a direct or indirect result of not only the Enlightenment but also the age of science, the classical century, Newton, Descartes, Bacon, etc., Galileo, etc., etc., the 17th century, and Locke, etc. Yeah, so it has been a great success, but it does not appeal a lot to. It doesn't get, that's the thesis of Pinker, but actually I kind of agree. It does not exert a great appeal. If you look at the results, they are absolutely exceptional. It's exceptional. What the world, driven by Western ideals, has achieved over the past couple of centuries, it's unprecedented. It's the numbers and the achievements in technology, science, politics in the sense of development and economics, etc., development of international rights, emancipation, at least in the sense of formal rights, opportunities, etc., etc., abolition of all sorts of pre-modern, not in the good sense, practices, it has been a tremendous success. It cannot be denied. The facts speak for the Enlightenment. In this sense, I haven't read the full book, but the arguments are convincing. Yeah. But the reason why the Enlightenment ideals, or if these are not the ideals, at least the Enlightenment worldview does not appeal as much as it could or as much as it should, maybe, is precisely because it lacks an element of emotional attachment, one might say, that which Romanticism provides. It's more instinctive, the subjectivity, the emotions, the personality, the flow of imagination, experiences in terms of feelings, the inner workings of the soul, dreams, harmony with nature, harmonious life with nature, with the community, a form of collective life, a spontaneous outburst of folk culture, religious communities, etc. It's more appealing, at least at first glance. It captivates the imagination much more than the dry and boring views of the Enlightenment. And precisely, I will develop on that a little bit. I understand why, at least Europeans, even though it's unconscious for the tremendous majority of them, they are not very excited or fascinated or very enthusiastic, one might say, about the Enlightenment, although they live and enjoy the benefits of modern economics, individualism in the good sense, liberty, political liberty in the good sense, etc. They enjoy the benefits daily, but it's not very, it's not sufficient for the soul, one might say, because precisely it's a little bit dry and boring. That's the emptiness of materialism in the realm of economics and mechanistic worldview in the realm of science, which most people, they are not aware, but they feel in a way some sort of they do not feel at ease, or they feel a lack in their soul. That's not how they express it, but they don't really like certain aspects of modernity, although from an objective standpoint, there is a lot of opportunity, prosperity, comfort, very pleasant aspects, but a lot of Europeans, not only, but here I talk about Europeans, it means anthropological Europeans, they feel unconsciously some sort of a inadequacy, or a lack, or a miss, a dis-ease, not a disease, a disease, but literally, like it's not a lack of well-being in a way, but they cannot formulate this, and yeah, because Romanticism is much more appealing artistically, not necessarily because here a statue like this, in a way, it's not classic, it's not classical, although it is in a way. It's from the Renaissance, but it's inspired from classical art. So the classical forms of art, balance, measure, proportions, it's very appealing actually. Romantic art can be more out of the boundaries, more unbounded, more excessive for the good, or not necessarily most of the time the good. It's more excessive, it's less rigorous. It's not necessarily less rigorous, but it's less ordered, it's more spontaneous, so it can appeal more, and usually romantic art is very appealing. The poetry is sublime, the paintings are sublime, the novels, the novels, they captivate the imagination, etc. So it's very appealing. But precisely, it lacks sometimes, when it's excessive, a little bit of rigor. And I thought about this this morning when I meditated on my carpet, yoga carpet, which is my mattress basically. I was meditating about this, and in a relationship, from the perspective of a wife or a woman, I try to imagine how she envisioned the masculine partner, either the boyfriend or the companion or the husband. There has to be passion, romance, precisely, and excitement. It's important, of course, it's very important, but if there is just the passion and the romance, if the man is not serious in the sense a good husband or a good father, a responsible father, a good husband, etc., it can be very passionate, but it will not last very long, or if it does, it might bring suffering for both, or whereas here I envision how women think about the ideal man. Of course, there has to be the romance, the passion, the excitement, etc., of course, but also women, they expect, either consciously or unconsciously, the man to be serious and to provide resources, stability, prospects for the woman and for the kids in terms of standards of living, etc., or at least stability, security, etc., and that's the role of the good father and the responsible good father and the responsible good husband. And if we use the categories of marriage projected, or actually that's the opposite, the categories of European aesthetics onto marriage, the boring aspect of a marriage, in the sense you have to work the 9-to-5 job, make an income, you have to be serious, etc., rigorous, manage the household, you have to save money for the future. You have to do the daily routine to keep the, okay, it's kind of a little bit boring, but this is what enables to provide stability, security, and eventually to perpetuate the relationship in a harmonious way on the longer term for the husband and the wife, but also the kids. So it's necessary. It's not necessarily always exciting, but it's a part of a successful marriage, the boring aspect, either on an individual standpoint, namely each spouse, spouse, whether the male or the female, has to do the boring part of his or her role. But then sometimes there are moments, I guess, where the two are together, and it's not always very exciting, especially maybe after a few years, but it's part of what a marriage is. Namely, you have to be responsible, serious in a sense, responsible. Yeah. And that would be the Enlightenment aspects, namely what women call sometimes, or do not dare call this, but actually that's what they seek, a provider. The Enlightenment aspect of the husband in a marriage, that would be the serious provider, the guy who is serious. He works hard, he takes care of his household, he takes the decision for the wife, the future of the kids, the stability of the marriage, etc. There is a boring aspect, but this is what enables success in the longer term, and the periods of success and stability, they enable the moments of romance and passion to keep going. Maybe for the long marriages it becomes less frequent, but if it's very extended, it will happen often if they can keep. Nietzsche says somewhere, what is important. I don't know exactly how he formulates it, but he says the problem in a lot of marriage is not the lack of love, but the lack of friendship. Yeah, so if you can keep the love which put you into the marriage in the first place while having friendship, it will last longer, and eventually, because it will be more extended in time, there will be more frequent moments of enthusiasm, so it will be more intense in a way. Yeah. And if you just have the Enlightenment aspect, just the boring aspect, you are a provider. If there is just this, eventually you become kind of a beta male, and the woman, she will seek excitement somewhere else, either by cheating on the husband or by escaping through fantasy novels or whatever. Yeah. But if you have the other aspect, if you are the lover, in terms of male-female relationship, you are the lover, that would be the romantic aspect. You provide passion, excitement, etc. That's great, but it's very intense. But if you just have this, on the longer term, the relationship will quickly fail. And even if the woman loves you, at some moment she will probably say, okay, it cannot last. So it may be very intense, very exciting for a few months or a few years, but eventually it will not work and it will bring suffering to both. Yeah. So you have to have both aspects. Of course, it's difficult to be the lover archetype who provides excitement, passion, the flame of love. If it doesn't burn too much. To keep the flame going, but also you have to be kind of serious as a husband and as a father, and that's the Enlightenment ideal. So the perfect husband, he's both romantic and Enlightenment, Apollo and Dionysos, I might say. Yeah, it's very difficult, but that's the ideal. And now we talk about economics. I have studied economics for a long time, many months, and I have produced videos and documents about household management for my own personal use. It has helped me a lot, and I know it can help a lot of people. It's not because I'm really interested either in economics or in household management, but precisely I try to be responsible and serious and competent, and it's part of growing up, maturing, and being responsible, you have to do sometimes things that you don't like, but that's part of the job. I'm not talking about economic job, but the whole, yeah. And economics, it's not really interesting. I mean, it can be theoretically for the people who enjoy reading good books, serious, rigorous work, it can be enjoyable to read theoretical economics, but actually it's not really interesting. Here, that's a personal opinion, but I'm not really interested in the theoretical aspect of economics as such, but I feel a sense of responsibility, and it has to be part, at least the basics, of culture, for men, at least. For women, that would be household management. For men, that would be economics. You have to be able to think correctly to understand the fundamental determinations, even if you don't like this. And of course, because I've asked myself this question, a lot of people in the West, in the world at large, but in the West, they fall prey to the politicians who promise them better standards of living. We will redistribute money. Our plan, our 5-year plan, will bring prosperity, increase in growth, whatever, whatever. Yeah, and the people, they buy this nonsense. I understand why, but I have been at some moment frustrated because the people, here it means working class, middle class, people in a sociological sense, namely those who are not the elite, basically. It's not derogatory, but it's the common people, working class, middle class, yeah. In the West, in some countries, they tend to complain often about the economic situation, and rightly so, because there are problems, but they very often do not understand the causes. And what I have found frustrating at some moment is that here Mr. Jeff Deist, talks about this in his book A Strange Liberty. He says all the knowledge about economics is available. There are countless of books, lectures, references, articles, bibliographical data, etc., for those who are interested. But precisely the problem, what can be a little bit frustrating when you are aware of the intellectual aspect of economics, is that all the knowledge, the successful pieces of advice, the theoretical treatises, the intelligent analysis, they have been provided, and they are still being provided predominantly by the Mises Institute. Mises spoke the truth about economics already 100 years ago. It's a process, it has to be refined, but basically Mises understood, and it has been constantly being proven correct by the constant failure of all socialist attempts on 4 different continents with different people, different culture, different ethnicities, different religious groups. It has constantly failed, predominantly for the reason that Mises talked about, and then Hayek later talked about this again, and then Rothbard, Hopper, and the modern thinkers of the Mises Institute, Per Byland, Di Lorenzo, etc., etc. So Mises has been constantly proven correct. So what can be a little bit frustrating is that the people, they tend to be interested in the economy, but while not being interested in economics, they are interested, of course, in standards of living, opportunities, wealth, etc., of course, but they are not interested very often in the theoretical aspect, and they trust politicians which deceive them almost constantly. And when you see the trick, it's a little bit frustrating because the knowledge is available and the people, they do not very often make the effort to study. And here it's not usually, yeah, the people, they work very hard, they have bills to pay, it's difficult, yes, but a lot of people in the West, they still nonetheless have a certain amount of leisure, and there are not a lot of people who take the time during their leisure to study economics in order to solve the problems, or at least not to get constantly deceived or plundered. And when you understand this, it's a little bit frustrating, because you see that the masses of the people, they get constantly deceived by demagogues. So the Enlightenment in the realm of economics and household management and gender relationship, that's really the serious aspect in a good sense, responsibility, seriousness, accountability in the sense of thinking for the well-being of the individual, the household, the society at large, in the long term. It's really a responsible aspect. And the Americans, they used to, I don't know if it's still the case, but they used to be responsible, because I know that the book Economics in One Lesson, it's kind of a mandatory, by Hazlitt, it's kind of a mandatory reading, not officially as far as I know, but at least morally there are a lot of households who study this book to have a broad economic culture. And it has been very successful over the decades. And the Ron Paul Institute, Ron Paul provides economic literacy, economic education through his institute or his various programs to help educate people so that they do not get deceived. So that's very good. But there are not enough people who are interested in economics, although it has become dominant over the past decades and centuries in the West. So it's a little bit frustrating, but I've understood now. Precisely because people, they would like to be to escape, in a sense, escape in a different reality, that the kind of a dreamy aspect that Romanticism can provide, art, religion, culture, communities, folklore, myth, legends, poems, artistic expressions, etc., etc. I understand, because I find this much more interesting than economics as well. But to be responsible and to be balanced, you have to have both aspects. If you are just dreaming of an alternative reality, you might become a Marxist, and that's kind of a problem. I know that there are Marxist intellectuals who are, in a way, romantic revolutionaries. A guy whose name is Levy, Michael Levy, something like this. I've not read the books, but I'm vaguely familiar. Yeah. So the romantic aspect, it has captured the imagination of some Marxists and some libertarians, which can be quite surprising, but actually, no. Do we see? With the lights, there's a little bit. Ayn Rand, the Romantic Manifesto. So Romanticism has captured the imagination of some Marxists, the best ones, one might say, and some libertarians, the best ones as well. I mean, I'm not talking here about Ayn Rand personally, but the libertarians, if they just talk about economics, they are boring and bland and dry, and I understand why the people precisely are not interested in this, because it can be boring. But there are those who, I've already said this, Jeff Deist, that's that's not Catwoman, but it's like Catwoman in the Batman movie. There's more to you than that. Jeff Deist represents seriousness of the Enlightenment with more than just economics, and Ron Paul as well, in a way, and Jefferson, of course, as well. That's what I've been working on basically for a year now. In order to appreciate really the good aspects of spontaneity and to let go a little bit from the burdensome aspect of daily existence, there has to be nonetheless stability and seriousness and structure, and only in economics, only the Austrians and the libertarians, and most of the time the right wing, can provide this seriousness, and that's what can be envisioned as the Enlightenment aspect. Because if you just have one aspect, just the Enlightenment, it's really dry, boring, and it becomes meaningless. That's really the modern, soulless Western world, completely devoid of, not completely, but mostly devoid in terms of politics and the media and overall the mood. It's devoid of soul. That's the criticism already of Evola, that it has become a soulless, mechanistic civilization. But if you have really just passion and irrationality, outburst of collective insanity, it can be left-wing insanity. Historically, this has been the French. Or right-wing, in a way, insanity. That's more the Germans, although there is an aspect of collectivism as well. But the French and the Germans, they have had their collective insanity moments historically over the past couple of centuries, and not necessarily for the good. There has to be seriousness and stability. With that which the frame, the structure, the infrastructure which enables the flowering of higher creative or contemplative aspects. That's the problem with religious communities. Here it means people who want to organize in communities based on religious affiliations. I'm not talking about ordinary people who go to church. I'm talking about people who want to live in ethno-cultural, or usually it's cultural, religious and cultural communities, but most of the time these are ethno-cultural religious communities. It can work, but most of the time it fails because there is no knowledge of economics. People they envision this with good feelings, to build a small community, a utopian community, whether left-wing or right-wing, but the overwhelming majority of the time it fails. It has failed for 2 centuries. Left-wing, right-wing, religious, etc., primitivist, collectivist, nationalist, whatever. Most of the time it fails because there is no focus on the economic aspect. So because actually when you grow up, because I can anticipate, but I'm very critical of myself. I know that I can appear to be very boring, and most of my life in the day-to-day experience is boring, but I have grown up and I've understood that actually you have to do boring stuff daily, in a way, not necessarily every day, but most of the time, to have stability and to grow and to be able to develop and to be able to progress, actually, to improve. And since I have started ordering my daily life and growing in independence on a personal level for 18 months now, almost, in a way, it enables to clarify my ideas. So I'm thinking better and better because I've had, for many years, the tendency to have really an outburst of creative thoughts that I did not even realize were really good thoughts. But now I have succeeded more and more in channeling, taming, but in a good sense, in taming and channeling, in a way, my creative thoughts by ordering and disciplining myself and my my daily environment, and now I still have creative and great ideas, but they are more refined in a way. Yeah. 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 And yeah, about Romanticism and the Enlightenment. Romanticism, in a way, in my view, it can be envisioned as the feminine side, the how should I say, in a way, it's a feminine, it's in a way it's the feminine part of a masculine expression of the European soul, in a way. In the sense, what I'm trying to express is that I'm not saying that Romanticism is feminine, because it's not, but the romantic, the great thinkers, poets, writers, philosophers, etc., painters, etc., musicians, they were all men, almost, not all of them, but the overwhelming majority were men, European men, and they were not feminine or effeminate, but the kind of expression, the romantic expression, in a way, it is more feminine while being masculine, but it's more feminine than really the dry aspect of the Enlightenment, because actually, yeah, that's what I wanted to formulate. Romanticism and the Enlightenment, these are two forms of masculine expression, and in these two forms, the romantic aspect is the more feminine, but in a good sense, in a sense of emotions and feelings, whereas the Enlightenment, it's really the dry, rationalistic aspect, which is, in a way, kind of purely masculine, but when it's too, when it's too intense, the light of the Enlightenment becomes like the light of the sun in a desert. It really becomes dry. So, yeah. That's why, in a way, Romanticism, here, yeah, there is an emotional aspect in the Enlightenment. David Hume and Adam Smith, they wrote about human morality founded upon feelings, empathy, sympathy, compassion, in a way. So they were not completely dry. But the tendency of the Enlightenment is to go astray in pure abstraction, rationalization, categorization, which becomes really bland, dry, and boring. That's the excesses of the Enlightenment. And the excesses of Romanticism, if it goes astray, is irrationality, emotionalism, in a way. So that would be excessive towards the feminine aspect. But when the two are really good, the best Enlightenment thinkers, they are not just boring and dry rationalists, and the best romantic writers, thinkers, philosophers, poets, they are not just emotional, irrational artists. They have a structured, in a way, and a balanced way as well. Yeah. But overall, Romanticism is more appealing, because really the Enlightenment can be really boring. Just the mechanistic, abstract aspect, it's not. That's the problem with the Enlightenment, is that, in a way, it's so successful. That's the thesis of the book. Actually, the problem is that the results, the objective results, have been astonishing, but there are very few people who celebrate this, because they fail to appreciate, in a way, the tremendous achievements. Yeah, that's really the wife whose husband has become a millionaire, but the wife has become used to it, maybe, so she prefers the I don't know, the poor guy that she met at whatever, a gardener or a restaurant cook or whatever, or I don't know, the wife who, I've already told this story, that's Rose in the Titanic, who falls for Jake, the working class, vigorous figure, which is poor and broke and etc. But he's more vigorous, and the boring husband, he's rich, etc. But he does not satisfy the inner aspirations of, I don't know, the female psyche. Yeah, so I understand this, but actually, when you become serious, you have to have both aspects, which is difficult, but yeah, and precisely. Okay, I've been talking for a while. The philosophy of the German metaphysician, the philosophy of Hegel, is an attempt to reconcile. I understood this more than 5 years ago, but this is part of the great ideas that I've had, and in a way, I was blinded. It still happens. I'm blinded sometimes. Here I'm not bragging, but I am blinded by my own brilliance. I mean, I really have really great ideas, but I don't realize that they are really great. Yeah, but one of the great ideas that I had, actually, it was not a brilliant idea, but it's just one might say a philosophical culture. But actually, I understood it's not my idea in the sense that there are already authors who formulated this in books, but actually, the philosophy of Hegel is an attempt to reconcile conceptually the Enlightenment and Romanticism, namely modern rationality and religious mysticism in a way. It's the most serious, in a good sense, the most serious attempt to reconcile both, actually. That's the philosophy of Hegel. It's the unity of both. There is, and that's why there are so many misunderstandings about Hegel, and why there have been so many misunderstandings, because he has been somehow taken hostage by the Marxists, who saw only a precursor of Marx, obviously. So Hegel has been interpreted as an atheist, rationalist, Enlightenment thinker. But actually, what he talks about under the veil of the formally rationalistic aspect, he talks about religion, obviously, mysticism, alchemy, hermeticism, telepathy, magic, mythology, divination, all sorts of stuff. So the things which usually capture the imagination of people, but actually the difference between Hegel and all the occultist, esoterist, hermeticist, alchemist, or whatever, is that he does this seriously. Yeah. This is what the book by Glenn Alexander Magee explains. Yeah. So Hegel, the philosophy of Hegel is, I understood this 5 years ago, but it's the thinker who reunited Europe. If we divide, here it's a simplification, but the opposed and conflicting, but in a productive and in a good way, the conflicting tendencies of what could be called the European soul throughout the centuries and the millennia even, he has successfully succeeded in reconciling the two aspects. And I know enough about Hegel that he's critical of the Enlightenment because it's dry and boring, but he's critical of Romanticism because it's not serious enough. So there are the two aspects. Yeah. basically formulated differently in case it's not clear. Hegel is just a guy who talks about religion, mysticism, magic, etc., but in a rigorous way, actually. Yeah. That's why he's misunderstood by both sides, because, yeah. And, yeah, what I understood precisely, when I unconsciously understood this more than 5 years ago, it was a process, but I believe that's why I first, when I discovered Hegel, seriously, what I say, for the first few months in 2018, I thought that he was the European thinker, which in a way it is, but the thing is that the thought of the Enlightenment, it has been brought forth, it arose in 18th century Europe, France, Scotland, England, Germany, Italy partly, but it's predominantly a Scottish, French, partly German, English movement, but especially the Scots, the French, and Kant, I might say, inspired by the English at first, because the French of the 18th century, they borrowed most of their ideas from the English of the 17th century. Yeah, so the Enlightenment, the ideas, and even the ideals, maybe sometimes the ideas more than the ideas, but rationality, the reason, science, they are universal. They are valid for all. The laws of mechanics, expressed by Newton in the 17th century, they are valid for all humans. The laws of economics, expressed in the 18th century by Adam Smith, it has to be developed, refined, corrected, etc. But the fundamental principles, they are true for everyone. The technical development by James Watt, enabled by James Watt and all those who contributed to the development of the steam engine, etc., it works everywhere, basically. Thermodynamics and mechanics in the realm of technology, that's not how it was called, because thermodynamics developed later as a theoretical corpus of concepts, etc. But actually, the use of steam to provide mechanical and technological energy, it can be applied everywhere. So the Enlightenment contains a universal and universalist aspect. It was born in Western Europe, but then it can, and actually it did, spread everywhere. It was more or less adapted or adopted, or both, by other parts of the world, more or less successfully adopted and more or less adapted to the specificities. But actually, even the most anti-modern, let us simplify, countries in the world, they nonetheless live by, they are the products of the Enlightenment. Yeah. So, yeah, that's why there's a universal aspect. And Romanticism, in a way, it's more specifically European, in a sense that it's a phenomenon, if we think in the long term, through the various manifestations, already in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, but the Middle Ages, and even before, certain tendencies of the European soul, one might say. It's, in a way, it's specifically European, but there are aspects which can be found in other civilizations. The Japanese, I wouldn't say that the Japanese have history of Romanticism, but there are tendencies in the Muslim world. There have been poets and mystics who have had insights which cannot be called romantic, but the Indian, so some Muslim thinkers throughout the centuries, India, in a way, there's a certain aspect, as far as I know, Japan partly, so it cannot be called Romanticism because precisely it's a specifically European feature, but there have been, it can partly be adopted by others as well because it's a particular aspect of the European psyche, but there is a universal aspect as well. But precisely the Enlightenment is more extensively universal, I might say. It's more extended because it appeals to the mind, and it's more easy to equalize through the mind than through the complexities of the heart, one might say. That's pretty much what I could speak a little bit more, but actually, basically, when it is politicized, Romanticism, not necessarily consciously as such, but conservative, reactionary, romantic ethos, one might say, it can lead to irrationality. That's what Mr. Pinker complains about. Mythology, when it is politicized, mythology, irrationality, etc., etc. We have seen this in the 20th century. Well, so yeah, it can be excessive. So I understand why. Precisely. That's why there has to be balance, and that's why someone like Jefferson and Ron Paul in today's world, and Jeff Deist, in a way, they are not romantics, obviously, but they are not dry and boring either. They are kind of in a subtle middle, in a sense that there is the serious aspect, like there has to be production, business, exchange, and seriousness in the realm of economics and politics. It has to be serious for a society to function, but there is the revolutionary aspect, namely it appeals to the imagination, and in the sense that the kind of dream, they do not offer dreams, but actually in a way they do, that they offer, precisely it's not complete nonsense. It's not a delirium like sometimes the Germans can have, or the French, in another way, the French or the German, they can become a little bit delirious. The Anglo-Saxons, they are more, in a way, they are more boring in what they offer, but actually what they offer is precisely that which enable to bring about the structure of society, which then enables individuals to go about their own intellectual or spiritual or romantic wanderings without disrupting everything, like the French in the early 19th century after the Revolution, or the Germans in the 20th century did. So the English, in a way, here, if there are English people listening to it, they will not be surprised. The English, in a way, they are the perfect husbands. There is the lover aspect. Maybe it's not as exciting as, I don't know, other groups, but I'm sure that the English are great lovers, great husbands, great fathers. The Englishmen, at least of the 19th century, they had all the qualities. Yeah, yeah. I was thinking about this yesterday while walking. I was thinking about the English, the Anglo-Saxons, but specifically the English. And I was I was thinking, but they have all the qualities. Actually, no, they don't. But actually, they have an enormous amount of qualities. They are a little bit privileged. These English. They have good humor, a great history, a high culture, a good character. They have been prosperous. They really have won the lottery. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I thought about Romanticism and the Enlightenment. And now I intend to talk about Nietzsche and Christianity. These are thoughts that I've had yesterday. First, I thought about this morning. Nietzsche is a genius. Usually, when I think about Nietzsche or when I read Nietzsche, it's kind of a comical relief because the suffering sometimes of existence are very difficult. But Nietzsche is always positive, one might say. Hegel is Hegel is almost always negative. So Nietzsche has to be positive most of the time to balance. But actually, Nietzsche, if I'm serious, he does not always take himself very seriously in his writings, but Nietzsche really is a genius. I've never read or heard anyone say this. I know that Nietzsche is sometimes admired among the right, the radical right, among some leftists as well, among some libertarians, not the modern libertarian movement, but they are liberal in a way, but liberal in a sense of individualistic liberals. Not in a good sense. There is good individualism and less good. There are those who use Nietzsche because they just want, they are in an individualistic, egotistical trip, and they use the prestige of Nietzsche, and here it's not always relevant, but yeah. So Nietzsche is kind of respected as a serious thinker, either on the right or on the left. He's not. He's opposed by a lot of leftist intellectuals. So in a way, that's why he's kind of respected, even on all sides, either on the right. There is a delusion. A lot of people, they delude themselves. They think that they misinterpret Nietzsche. But on the left, they don't really like Nietzsche because he exposes a lot of sometimes difficult truth about the psychology of a lot of people, but he's kind of respected nonetheless because when you are a left, I know this because I was a leftist many years ago. When you are a leftist, you know what, Nietzsche is a problem because you cannot just say, let us get rid of this. It's very, you can accuse, you can use the usually leftist tactic. You accuse, of course, Nietzsche. The bad guys of the 20th century, they drew inspiration from, or at least they claim that they did. So you can try to discredit Nietzsche by association with people who did bad things. That's what they do, like Heidegger, etc. But Nietzsche, in a way, is less guilty, obviously, because he was in the 19th century and he did not, he was not involved in politics, etc. So you can try to discredit Nietzsche like this, but actually, on the left, they don't talk a lot about Nietzsche because precisely his critical views, not of leftists, because Nietzsche was in a way beyond left and right, but his critical insights into the human psyche and some of the deception of the delusion, the self-delusion of humans, they are very relevant, and they expose a lot, not only about humans in general, but specifically about leftists, about right-wingers as well. Nietzsche was very critical, and when you are intelligent and when you read Nietzsche, in a way, you understand the intelligent criticism coming from intelligent leftist scholars, namely, Nietzsche was not some sort of a proto-nationalist. No, it's much more subtle than that. So, yeah. Nietzsche, in a way, he's a problem for the left and for the right, even though usually these are more right-wingers who draw inspiration from Nietzsche, but actually he's a problem for a lot of people, but not in a sense, he's kind of a problem to solve. Yeah. Because what he says most of the time is really insightful and very intelligent. It's not, yeah, what I mean when I say Nietzsche is a problem in the sense that it's not easy to dismiss Nietzsche. That's why it's not a clown, although he can bring a lot of comical relief and a lot of appeasement. I mean, appeasement, well, sometimes. He can bring a lot of growth, yeah, growth. Because that's why I said Nietzsche is a genius. When you really are kind of vaguely intelligent, when you read Nietzsche, you have to respect most of what he said, even when he behaves like a clown with some of his references, but some of his references or some of his remarks. He tries and very often succeed in expressing really deep truth in a comical way, but comical from a really high philosophical standpoint. But when you dig under the comical surface, Nietzsche really is a genius, and I admire him, obviously. Yeah. He is not, how should I explain this? He's not taken seriously enough because he's kind of misunderstood, but he's really a very serious, in a good sense, a very serious intellectual and thinker. And I thought about this morning, but I've had this thought for many years. The German philosophers, in a way, they are a little bit, I wouldn't say sinister. Well, when I'm in a bad mood, I say, okay, they are a little bit sinister. No, they are not sinister, but they are, they can be, well, it's not always very joyful, but precisely Nietzsche kind of stands out. He's a little bit apart in a sense that within the German philosophical family, he's a maverick, one might say, but he is serious nonetheless. That's the genius, is that he stands out and stands apart from all the other great German metaphysicians, Leibniz, Kant, Schelling, Fichte, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Heidegger. He's a little bit different, like Schopenhauer as far as I know, but he's more different than the other in a sense that, yeah, that's why what I mean. Nietzsche, you know, he cannot be compared with Kant, Leibniz, or Hegel in terms of seriousness, but he's very serious nonetheless. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to express. Nietzsche is not Leibniz, but it's a different kind of seriousness, and yeah, and you gotta respect that because he complained in the books that I've read recently over the past month, Ecce Homo, he complains about being misunderstood or being misappreciated. But actually, when you do understand some of the things that he says, he really is truly great. Yeah. 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 And so no, I intend to talk about Christianity. These are thoughts that I've had yesterday and this morning, but they did not spontaneously come like this, although in a way they did, but the thoughts are not new, but the way I can express them now, there is a big misunderstanding about what I would call the spirit and the letter. People have noticed this. They really have, a lot of people, they have really a literal understanding of things. And here, that's where the speculative logic is important. Reality, here I will not talk about speculative logic too much, but basically reality from a conceptual standpoint, that the unity of an sich and sein für anders, what is in itself and what is for another, and in order for something to be real, it has to be for another what it is in itself, or it has to be in itself what it is for another, and when the an sich and the sein für anders coincide, it is real. Formulated differently, in the logical unfolding of the categories, inner and the outer, when they coincide, this is Wirklichkeit, which means actuality, in a way it's a higher form of reality. It's more complex than that, but if I had to simplify, an sich would be the inner, sein für anders would be the outer, inside and external, or inner and external, and in order for something to be real, they have to coincide. That's why an appearance is false in the sense that what seems to be, or what looks like, or what appears to be, it's not necessarily true, because you have the sein für anders, it seems to be, or it is for another, so it seems, but you are not sure that it really is as it looks to be. So yeah, so that's why appearances are not necessarily revealing, they can be hiding that which they are supposed to express. So yeah, but yeah, so sein für anders an sich, formulated differently, the form and the content, formulated differently, the spirit and the letter. A lot of people, they get very easily misled or deceived by the outer, or by the literal aspect, or by the formal presentation, but they do not succeed in exploring the inner, or the content, or the spirit, in the sense, the meaning, if you will. And that's why formalism is kind of empty. It can be empty, because I will talk about Christianity. There are the formal Christians, namely people who self-identify as Christians, but that's why there are many misunderstandings, because like there are the formal pagans, or the formal any denomination, but here I will briefly define spirituality, not in the sense mysticism, religious, no, spirituality in a sense of what the Germans call Witz, namely in modern American language we call this a one-liner, the ability to express one-liners or a punchline. Witz, that's the 18th century romantic, early 19th century romantic terminology to express what in the modern West we call a one-liner or a punchline, namely spirituality or spiritual, the adjective spiritual means someone who can make one-liners, punchline, who can find a proper word, who can express something brilliant in a formula which is like a punchline. In the sense, this person is spiritual, even though he might not be religious at all. Here, in a sense, a spiritual man, in the sense that here I define, would be a person who is capable of making punchlines. No, but actually, yes, persons who can, how do you call this in English? Witty, yeah, witty. A witty remark, yes. There, Witz in German, then witty remark, and then punchline. They kind of express the same idea, but persons who are witty, in the sense who are capable of making insightful, relevant remark, in a way they are spiritual in the sense that I've just mentioned. You know, they are able to express intelligent things in a artistic way. What am I saying? Not artistic, in a catchy phrase. Yeah, but not a catchy phrase which is just empty slogan, but a catchy phrase which is witty, which is smart. Yeah, that's partly the difference between intelligence and smart. You can be intelligent but not be very smart or very witty, and you can be very smart or very witty without being formally intelligent. And here, the English, I said earlier that they had almost all the qualities. The English working class, from a sociological standpoint, the English workers, they are not more intelligent than other workers just because it's a bell curve and there has to be more or less intelligent people. So they are not more intelligent than other workers in other countries with the average same level of quantitative intelligence. But the English working class, they are much more smart and witty than most others. The English, here what I'm trying to express is that English people with an average or lower than average level of intelligence in comparison to the bell curve, the bell-shaped curve, which it's not a problem at all because there are people who are above and people who are below the means. Yeah, but in England, as far as I can envision, the people who are less than average in purely quantitative intelligence or slightly below average or average, they are not more intelligent than the more intelligent ones, obviously, because they are below average, and not more intelligent than people with the same quantitative amount of intelligence in other countries, but they are much more witty and much more smart in a way. They are capable, and here, the reason is in English working class culture is much more creative than almost anywhere else. The Americans as well, of course. But the English, really they stand apart. The history of rock music, punk rock, etc., etc. The working class English people, they really are above their elites sometimes, but above most other socially less privileged groups, one might say, in a sense that they are much more witty. Yeah. I do not underestimate the wittiness of the even slightly less intelligent English people. I mean, there are intelligent people who are witty in a lot of countries. In a way, in some Middle Eastern country, people with an average or below average level of intelligence, they can be very witty as well. I would say in Russia, maybe as well. Well, the French, here I talk about the countries that I know more. The French, the French, they are not witty. I mean, some of them are. They have what is called common sense, but actually not politically, but on an individual level. The average French worker, which historically has been kind of a peasant for many centuries, many millennia, he's not maybe as witty as what I envision to be the working class English person, but he has common sense. The English as well, but in a sense, yeah, the people with, on average, a lower level of intelligence, they might not be intelligent in terms of IQ, obviously, because of the distribution, but they can be smart or witty or have common sense. Yeah. Or be cunning. Yeah, sometimes it can help, but yeah, no, but what was I saying? Yeah, so about being witty. Yeah, so I imagine the British humor, British underground culture, British pop culture. That's precisely what the Romantic thinkers call the genius of a people. Namely, there are the individual geniuses, and here in the case of England, Newton, Darwin, Francis Galton, and many others, Stuart Mill, etc., etc. There are the geniuses. John Locke, I mean, the geniuses. Newton and Darwin, they were geniuses. Galton as well, but he was kind of not a tainted genius, but a specific type of genius. But then all the great intellectuals like Russell, Whitehead, etc. Yeah. So in a way, here I just make a remark. Francis Galton, in a way, he's more of a genius than someone like Bertrand Russell. But actually, Bertrand Russell is more influential and in a way more prominent in a way. But Galton, he had really a great imagination while being productive. Yeah. And Stuart Mill was a quantitative genius like Blaise Pascal in France, but he has been very influential, but not as much as he could have been given the really high level of intelligence. Yeah, these are examples. Blaise Pascal, Leibniz, Stuart Mill, these are people who are really geniuses on an individual level with a very, very high level of intelligence, but they haven't achieved as much, for various reasons, as much as they could have, considering their exceptional level of quantitative intelligence. They have been very influential and they have produced exceptional works, but it just illustrates that a really high IQ, because I know that Pascal, Leibniz, and Stuart Mill had very, very, very high IQ. They achieved a lot, but there are people with significantly less important quantitative level of intelligence while remaining very high. People who had an IQ of 160, let's say, instead of 185 or more, or I don't know, but who achieved more in a way, or who were more influential. Yeah, it's like in sport. There are those who are extremely talented, but paradoxically, which actually is not paradoxical, but sometimes they achieve less than those who are less talented, but they have other qualities like work ethic or dedication, etc., etc. Yeah, there are in sports, football, soccer, basketball, tennis, people who are really highly gifted, but they do not achieve as much as they could potentially, or as it is envisioned. And there are people who are slightly less talented and who achieve much more in terms of results because for other reasons. Yeah. What was I talking about this? Yeah, so of course there are the geniuses on an individual level, and here if I talk about England, that would be I don't know, Darwin, Newton, Shakespeare, etc. But the genius of a people, that's a romantic view in a way, namely that the ordinary people has a genius of its own that is expressed through folklore, customs, just traditions, etc. Yeah. And then, yeah, the romantic view is, of course, that each people has its own genius as a collective entity which expresses itself through individual geniuses in art, science, philosophy, etc., but also who expresses itself in a more pervading way through collective expressions like customs, tales, songs, the language, or the character of a people, which cannot be very rigorously defined or measured or quantified, but yeah. And here, a little bit of trash talking against the English. Precisely if you said to an Englishman, the English, on average, they are witty, the English ordinary people, the Englishman would say, I'm not sure I have to to lead an empirical investigation. I will start making polls, quantifying, making interviews, researching. Is it really true? Can it be quantified? If it cannot be quantified and measured, that's just random assertion, etc. So the English people, maybe that's one of their flaws. They would use their own intelligence to downgrade themselves because it does not fit their own criteria of empirical, inductive, hypothetical testing, etc. If someone praised the English people, like I just did, probably some empirically minded Anglo-Saxon intellectuals, they would say, can you back this up with data? Do you have quotations, sources, measurements? Can it be validated in a laboratory with testing, experiment, etc.? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I was talking about spirit. In a sense, witty. Spiritual people here means people who are capable of making witty remarks, enlightening remarks, punchlines, etc., etc. Un bon mot, as they call this in French, which literally means a good word, or un mot d'esprit, a word of spirit. But here it's not connected with religion or mysticism or whatever. It's just being spiritual in a sense, being brilliant in the ability to express ideas, even if the intelligence can be limited or the culture can be limited. That's what I meant. People with no culture, in the sense of high culture, training, education, educational background, they can be very witty. This is what the Romantics loved about the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages was not an age of great literacy for the mass of the people, but the people had a collective genius of its own, nonetheless, in festivals, tales, songs, ceremonies, rituals, customs, etc. Daily life, collective life, that's what the Romantics admired in the Middle Ages. Whereas the Enlightenment thinkers, they despised the Middle Ages because it was the realm of superstition, irrationality, feudal oppression, burden for the individuals by ties, to the landlord, the communities, etc. No economic freedom, or few economic freedom, at least in certain parts of Europe, etc. That's why the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century, but all those who carry on the torch, for them the Middle Ages is an age of obscure, retrograde, regressive, dark age, whereas for the Romantics of the 19th century and later, whether they identify themselves as such or not, it's an age of cultural flourishing and religious expression, manifold expression of religious impulses, one might say. Yeah. And here I make a remark. Novalis, the German poet, wrote poetry, a hymn to the night, praising the night. That's a romantic topic, the romanticization of the night, whereas the Enlightenment, that's clear daylight, so that's light and dark, or day and night, and the Romantics, they were more, in a way, they were darker in this sense. That's vaguely what seduces the Gothic trends in the early 2000s in Western countries. It's a form of Romanticism. Marilyn Manson, it's vaguely derived, and what I thought about is that Lady Gaga made a great song, Marry the Night, and in a way it's an expression of the European soul. This is, there's a connection between, a pervading trend from Novalis, the great, or the Romantic poets at large of the end of the 18th, early 19th century, and someone like Lady Gaga in some of her songs, or Eminem in a song like Crazy in Love, or Lady Gaga in Marry the Night. These are expressions of Romanticism, and they are unconscious, but given the context of the current modernity, it is as romantic as it can get in mainstream pop culture, and these artists are probably not consciously aware of the implicit references that they use, but it's because it's pervading their soul in a way. Yeah, and Marry the Night by Lady Gaga is an exceptional song. Lady Gaga is an exceptional artist, and yeah, it's in the romantic trend. Here, in this sense, that's why there is a universal European soul, because it pervades the cultural expression of Europeans, even though they have no conscious awareness of this. Yeah. Yeah. So, about spirituality in the sense that I define, I mean the ability to see the spirit rather than the letter, or the content rather than the form, or the an sich rather than the Sein für anders. About formal Christians, people who identify as Christians because they were raised Christians, or because they go to church, or because they vaguely identify as Christian because of the culture or whatever. I thought about this this morning when I had inspiring thoughts while lying on the ground on my yoga carpet. I've understood that actually, precisely here I will illustrate. It's really a good illustration. An example of spirit in the sense of witty remarks. Hegel and the Romantics, Romantic poets, they already talked about this. The ability to unite in a short manner, in a formula, what the French call un trait d'esprit, a witty remark, a punchline, as they call this in the modern world, to unite in a punchline determinations, ideas in a broader sense, in a vague, ordinary sense, thought determination or images or representations which seem to be completely different, and to unite them in a punchy way, in a one-liner. This is an illustration of spirit. Here, in the sense, in a way, in the highest sense, that's what humor, good humor, is spiritual, because it's the ability to connect things which seem completely disconnected. And it can, I've noticed that spirit in this simple sense can have a profound impact upon people, because a lot of people, in essence, they are not very spiritual because they do not see connections. And when you show them some connections, they find this enlightening suddenly. And here, an example, something that I understood many years ago, which for me has kind of always been self-evident, but I've realized that actually it's not self-evident for a lot of people. But Marxism, the leftist ideology as a whole, generally, not always, but most of the time, the leftist ideology, and especially Marxism over the past 150 years, and in the modern world, it would be kind of the woke ideology, which is not consciously Marxist, but the various avatars of the left, and over the past 150 years, the most influential has been Marxism. It's a form of Christianity because it's simply secular Christian eschatology, in a way, like the woke ideology. That's why, of course, from a formal aspect, the woke people or the Marxists or the leftists of all sorts, the overwhelming majority of the time, they do not identify as Christians or as religious, and sometimes they even are openly hostile to Christianity. But actually, in a way, the spirit is Christian, because the work of Marx is just Christian theology applied to the realm of economics. It's a millenarist perspective. The form is completely different. Marx was an atheist. Most Marxists, or if not all of them, they are atheists. And they sometimes even are anti-religion, anti-church, consciously, but actually the spirit of their ideology is Christian, in a sense that Christianity, when it appeared historically, it was a religion. There, that's the view of Nietzsche, but it's kind of true. It was a religion for the lowest members of society from a sociological standpoint. Mostly the slave. Here, that's kind of the right-wing mythology, which is very critical of Christianity. They say basically this was the religion of the sewers, the slaves in the sewers of Rome, when Rome was decadent. Christianity appealed a lot to them because it talked about an afterlife where the poor, the weak, the sick, those who suffer, they would inherit the kingdom. So it was, here I will talk about Nietzsche, but that's kind of the Nietzschean view, formulated differently, but basically that Christianity, historically, when it appeared, it was a religion which appealed to the poor, the weak, the suffering, the sick, the inadapted of all sorts, because it promised a utopia, an afterlife where there would be bliss or happiness, or at least healing of the suffering, the end of suffering, etc., etc. Nietzsche somewhere said that there was an epidemics of suicide, in a way, in the declining Rome. I don't know if it's empirically true, but actually that's the view of Nietzsche. But it was a cure against the temptation of suicide, maybe, because precisely that's what Nietzsche says somewhere, and he's partly right. In even if it's not empirically correct, the spirit is kind of correct. It was a cure against what today we would call depression. The people in the Roman Empire, they were not depressed because they did not have the same relationship to individual psychology that the modern world has, but they were nonetheless existentially, not in the modern sense, but they were living under very difficult conditions when the empire was kind of crumbling, declining, etc. Economically, politically, there were tension, etc. So it was an opium. That's what Marx said when he talks about religion, but basically it offered Christianity. It was very appealing to the lowest elements sociologically of declining Roman society, because it promised a happy or happy afterlife. Yeah. Yeah. And Marxist theology, one might say, is just a secularization of Christian millenarism, as they call this. Namely, the idea that the poor, the deprived, the dispossessed, the proletarian, as he called it, the poor, not necessarily economically, but the poor in a profitable life conditions, one might say, people who are deprived. Yeah, Marx called this, in his rigorous view, the proletarian. He has a definition, economic, socio-economic, etc. But basically, that simplified, the poor shall inherit the earth. That's Marxist theology, although Marx was an atheist. But basically, that's the message. That's just the message of Christianity translated into the terms of 19th century classical economics, with a little bit of Hegelian logic, a little bit of Jewish mysticism, etc. Even if Marx was consciously atheist, and even if the communists or the Marxists are consciously atheist, their theology, their political utopia is just Christian theology expressed in politics and economics, basically. And Marxism has failed economically, politically, all along the 20th century. Yeah, but the left keeps reappearing. Marx was not strictly speaking a leftist, although he's kind of on the left, but he did not think of himself as a leftist. But if we had to simplify, Marx is a leftist thinker. It's more balanced than that, it's more nuanced, etc., etc. Yeah, but basically, if we had to choose between left and right, he would be more on the left. I simplify. Even if the purpose was to abolish class distinction, to abolish, etc. But if we simplify. Yeah, so Marxism officially has kind of vanished because it has failed constantly. It has not disappeared, but there are very few rigorous orthodox Marxists in the modern world, at least in the West. But it takes another form, and the woke ideology, it's not directly connected with Marxism necessarily. In a way, the Marxists, the intelligent ones, they were more structured than the woke people. Intellectually, but wokeism, or whatever they call this, it's another form of Christian millenarism, namely the disenfranchised, the discriminated, the poor, or it's not the poor because they do not talk about economics, but the discriminated, those who are rejected, those who are oppressed, the oppressed will inherit the earth, etc. That's Christian, that's bad Christian mythology, reshaped, reformulated again and again. And Nietzsche understood this because, in his view, here I simplify. In the view of Nietzsche, the values of the ancient Greek world were healthy because the Greeks, up until the age of Socrates, so for Nietzsche, Socrates is kind of the Greek Jesus. He mixes Socrates and Jesus together, and he makes them his personal enemies in a way. And here, with respect for them, because he criticizes Plato and Socrates, and not Jesus as such, but he criticizes Socrates and Plato. But actually, you kind of respect him nonetheless, because because he acknowledges the tremendous influence that Socrates had. And when here I simplify, but when Nietzsche talks about Socrates, he identifies this with Christianity for philosophical reason, because precisely for Nietzsche, Socrates is the moment in Greek life, and in the life of the West in a way, where the values started to become inverted. The classical Greek, they celebrated beauty, strength, nobility of character and of blood, aristocracy, vigor, courage, excellence, strength, etc. The aristocratic values. Classical Greece was an aristocratic society. It had become more democratic because the old Mycenaean aristocratic ways of life and the Homeric times and the aristocracy of the Homeric times had already declined because of the modernization of the means of the military weapons, basically because war had become more democratic because of the new equipment. The hoplites, the Greek soldiers, they had to fight collectively in an ordered way, and no longer as individual aristocrats like it was the case in what is called the Dark Ages of Greece, between the year 1200 BCE and the year 800,000. Basically, there's a dark age between the fall of Mycenaean civilization and the reappearance or the appearance of what would become classical Greek culture with Homer and Hesiod. There are basically 4 centuries missing, kind of a dark age of ancient Greece. We don't know really what happened. There are not many sources, many data, etc., etc. So there was a decline from really an aristocracy dominating what could be called city-states in a way, or feudal domains, not in the sense of the feudalism of the Middle Ages, but here I simplify again. Kingdoms, yeah. Mycenaean kingdoms, etc. And then things happened for centuries and it changed that. And the classical Greek society of the 5th century BCE was still aristocratic, but it had become more democratic, either politically in Athens with the first appearance of a democracy and the overthrow of the tyrants, the Pisitrat, I don't know how you say it in English, Pisitrat, the tyrants of Athens were disposed of, I think, in 509 BCE, something like that. They were overthrown, basically broadly at the same time that the last kings of Rome were overthrown. So Athens was kind of invented political democracy. It was a process with Solon, Cleisthenes, Draco, Solon, Cleisthenes, who redistributed the land, gave more equal rights, etc. But it was an aristocratic democracy. It was limited to Athenian citizens by descent and people of wealth and property and free citizens, etc. And in Sparta, it was egalitarian as well, but differently. But it was some sort of militaristic collectivism. And here, because the means in the battlefield had changed, it was no longer a one-on-one fight between 2 aristocrats. That's how it was envisioned, at least in the Homeric tales. It was more group, block versus block. So the soldiers, in a way, their individual skills had become less important. It was more the position within the military structure which was important, the discipline, and the invention of shields and spears and new tactics, in a way, had equalized men in a way, because the hoplites had become a soldier within a collective, disciplined military organization. So in a way, the life of everyone became less valuable because survival and success on the battlefield was less dependent on individual skill, but at the same time it had become much more important because the life and the survival of individuals within the rigorously ordered Spartan, or not necessarily only Spartan, but especially among the Spartan, the life and the survival and the success of the military depended on the discipline of each individual, and that's why, in a way, the value of the life of the soldiers diminished because the need to be individually very competent in a one-to-one aristocratic battle declined, but at the same time it became much more important because in a very structured, cohesive unit, you had to be able to rely onto the guy next to you to protect you in a way. So that drove, here it's a materialist interpretation, there are other factors, but it gave an impulse towards equality, because on the battlefield the Spartans had become equals. That's how they call themselves, the homoioi, the equals, and it led to a certain form of political equality, some sort of collectivist, nationalist, militaristic society. Sparta, ancient Sparta, yeah. So in a way they were egalitarians, but they were also in a way party communist, but also nationalist, also collectivist, aristocratic, while being egalitarians, yeah. And yeah, but so that's the democratic aspect, but nonetheless ancient classical Greece. But Sparta was kind of unique among all other city-states, but in other city-states they developed more commerce, trade, etc., and art than just militarism like they did in Sparta. So Athens, Thebes, Corinth, the Corinthians, I don't know how you call this in English, the other important major Greek city-state, they were still in a way aristocratic, even in spite of the democratic aspects. There was still a ruling aristocracy or oligarchy, or there were still high hierarchies between the various citizens, depending on status, etc., wealth, etc. But the ideals and the values, they were aristocratic. The Greeks, they celebrated strength, virtue, beauty, good birth, courage, excellence, etc., etc. And Socrates, that's the view of Nietzsche, he kind of inverted these values. Yeah. So that was the first inversion of values in the West, in a philosophical sense. That was Socrates, who symbolically was kind of very ugly, whereas most of the Greeks, at least among the high classes, they were considered to be very beautiful. The Greek, they celebrated the beauty of their own people constantly, one might say. And Socrates, he imported in a way new values, where he focused on morality in a sense of doing good, but already in a pre-Christian sense, independently of excellence, achievement in an aristocratic way, doing good in a moral way. So he replaced, I simplify, aristocratic ethics with Christian morality, one might say. But Socrates, that would be the view of Nietzsche. He was a decadent among the Greeks, but the Greeks of the 5th century, they are probably the greatest people ever, probably. So he was a decadent among the very best. So he was still, with his value, he was still above a lot of subsequent eras of Western civilization, with ups and downs, but yeah. So Nietzsche accused Socrates of inverting the values by focusing on intellect and ratiocination, to rationalize in an excessive way, in a way. So he accused Socrates of bringing down the classical virtuous values, aristocratic values of Greece, of the Greeks, which promoted, favored enhanced, strengthened, encouraged excellence, aristocratic virtue, and not moralistic, moralizing in a way. Yeah, and this poison, that's the view of Nietzsche, this poison was implemented in the mind of the Greeks, and later that's not what Nietzsche said, but basically it already left a sufficient imprint for then Christian morality, 4, 5, 6, depending on the spread of Christianity, but 4 centuries later, no, 3 centuries later, 3 centuries later, basically Jesus, that basically 3 centuries after the death of Socrates, but then the time Christianity spread, it had already contaminated, Nietzsche would say, the Greek aristocratic mindset, and in the decadent Roman society, which had copied the Greeks for the best, but it had also negative consequences because it had softened the Romans a little bit. They became a little bit soft and decadent when they started to be influenced by Greek high culture. Yeah, that's the criticism of Rousseau, the Roman, and already of the Roman moralists. They were tough, strong-minded people, militaristic, etc., and they conquered the Greeks, and they were influenced by Greek culture, which made them develop art, but then they softened up a little bit, and they became eventually decadent many centuries later. So the declining, fading Roman Empire left the ground for the spread of Christian values, which from the perspective of Nietzsche are completely inverted values, because they put what is below, they put this above. They Christian values and morality, basically it praises weakness, poverty, modesty, sickness sometimes, suffering, etc., etc. The Greeks, they suffered as well, and they valued the ability to overcome suffering as well, like most all civilizations do. But Christianity did this in a different way. Nietzsche would say, in modern language, Christianity introduced victim mentality in the noble, aristocratic, ancient world. I simplify, yeah. And in this sense, leftist ideologies of all subsequent eras, they have, the left, is the way, it's political Christianity, basically. To say that the poor, the weak, the disenfranchised, the oppressed, the victims, whatever they call this, they have to overthrow the unjust, oppressive condition, to restore the kingdom. And the great shift, I simplify up to the utmost, but basically the view of Nietzsche is that what the Greek aristocratic culture and the ancient world considered to be noble, beauty, strength, excellence, virtue, courage, intelligence in an artistic way, in a way, beauty, strength, etc., etc., character, etc. What an aristocratic, what Nietzsche called virtue, but not moralistic religious virtue, virtue like the men of the Renaissance were virtuous in a sense, without moralizing, the virtue of excellence. Yeah, I simplify. So what was considered good in the pre-Christian world, according to Nietzsche, were the aristocratic principles, and Socrates and then Christianity inverted this perspective, and all these values over the ages, they have come to be considered in the West as being bad, and the opposites has been considered good. The Middle Ages, the religious Middle Ages, they celebrated penitence, modesty, guilt. They did not celebrate, but they promoted guilt, shame, repentance, poverty, moralism and virtue, but it can be good, but in a religious sense, weakness in a way, but it requires strength to promote weakness in a way. It's not a simple dualistic view, but the view of Nietzsche is that the Christian values of celebrating the weak in a broader sense had come to dominate, so it has been an inversion of values. But here the view usually of right-wingers is that there are those who say that the Germans, the Germanic people, have been Christianized, and by the time of the spread of Christianity, not the French, but the Franks, in what would later become France, the people in Middle Europa, in then Northern Italy, and then the Anglo-Saxons who emigrated to the British Isles, they were all Germanic. So the Greeks and the Romans, they were not a Germanic people. But then Christianity spread, of course, first in Italy and the Mediterranean area, Middle East, Northern Africa, Greece, Rome, etc., Spain, and then France, or what would become France. But then it spread to Northern Europe. So the Germanic peoples became Christianized. But then there are those who say that the Germans, here Germans mean Germanic people, not modern Germany, Germanic people. They became Christianized. And there are those who say that actually it is Christianity which became Germanized. Because the Christian values were those of really a decadent Roman Empire. It came from the Middle East with various influences, but predominantly from the Middle East. And in a way, it was partly incompatible with the pagan aristocratic values of Europeans, either the Romans at first, but then the barbarians, namely the pagans, the Germanic pagans of Northern and Central Europe. So they had to make some sort of a compromise, and the Germanic people were Christianized, but actually Christianity was Germanized in a way. That's the view of Hegel. And the Middle Ages were a Germanic age, and the Protestant Reformation as well, the Renaissance in northern Italy as well. These were partly Germanic people in northern Italy. They were Italians but of Germanic descent. The Protestant Reformation, then the scientific age with the English, Newton, Locke, then Descartes, etc., Bacon, Newton, Locke, Descartes in France, etc. And then the 18th century was, like I said, Scottish, French, partly German. Then the Romantic era was mostly Germanic, but then mostly German, but then French and English as well. So yeah, and then America, which was in the 19th century significantly a Germanic country. So that's the view of Hegel, basically the writings of Hegel, that Christianity encountered the Germanic people, and the compromise is the historical process over the past 15 centuries, one might say. Yeah. So, yeah, that's the view of Nietzsche. So, here, to say that the Marxist, the woke people, or the left, as such, is a Christian movement, it seems very strange for the people because they are opposed to the formal Christians, but actually the spirit, namely that the people who suffer, the weak, have to be empowered, as they call this, that's the Christian view. Yeah, and the formal Christians in the modern West, it was already the case in the 20th century, but to this day, usually these are people who are right-wingers, and they are formally Christian, but actually they in a way, they represent, I wouldn't say aristocratic values, because it's not the case. They represent bourgeois values. So those who self-identify as Christians in the modern West, most of the time they are rather conservative or right-wingers, but actually the real Christian from a spiritual standpoint, these are the leftists, because the political left is a secularization of the Christian views in a way. And it's not the case for the majority of the left, but there are groups or intellectuals within leftist circles who, in a way, consciously or unconsciously, they attack the healthy member of societies, namely traditional family, marriage stability, tradition, the economic structure, etc., because they think that by destabilizing society, it will bring about the conditions to restore or to establish the kingdom, which for them is whatever utopia they imagine. But the modern right is very far from the old aristocracy of the ancient world. Of course, it has been Christianized, because it has that's actually the historical process. The right is very often, if not always, a former left. The historical process goes ever more towards the left, and even the radical member of most right-wing circles already in the 20th century, but in the 21st as well, these are former leftists. The dictators of the right-wing dictators of the 20th century, these were former leftists. Mussolini was a socialist, Hitler as well. And people who are considered to be right-wing, like Mises, Hayek, the libertarians, the right-wing libertarians, these are just former leftists, not as individuals in their own, sometimes it is the case as well, but not as individuals, but their movement, the ideas that they defend, libertarian ideas, these were leftist ideas up until, a couple of centuries ago. The leftists, the liberals of the 19th century, in today's world, because the movement in the West goes ever more towards the left, they have become de facto right-wingers. Yeah. So reason was very often associated with the left, because in the context of the 18th century and even 19th century, the enlightened left opposed the religious right, which was reactionary, irrational, mystical, mythical. So the reason was on the side of the left. It was still the case in the 19th century. Someone like Stuart Mill. In the 20th century, the leftist reason has become technocratic, bureaucratic, planning. It has given the communist regime. It's a form of rationality, but it has brought about disasters. But in the modern West, reason has switched towards the right, which up until a couple of centuries ago was the right was irrational. Whether the populist, collectivist right of the 20th century or the aristocratic, feudal, reactionary right of the 19th century, they were irrational in a way, and the left was, I simplify because it's more complex, but the left was on the side of reason, enlightenment, and rationality. But in the modern world, the right, not all of them, but the libertarians, the conservatives, they are on the side of reason, and the left has become irrational. There are irrationalist politicals on the right as well in fringes circles. There are vaguely rational people among certain liberals still on the left, but the modern Western left is becoming more and more irrational, delirious in a way. The right adopts the values of yesterday's left, basically. Here it means 19th century, or sometimes even partly 20th century left. That's why being a classical leftist in the early 21st century Western world makes you a radical right-winger in a way. If you are true to the ideals of the Enlightenment, it's enough to make you a right-winger. Yeah. That's why there is a constant progress towards the left in the Western unfolding of history. And the conservatives of today are the liberals or the progressives of yesterday, basically. Yeah. Every modern right is a former left. It can be more or less empirically verified, not always, but most of the time. So praise to the left for having succeeded in gaining influence. It has not always been for the good. Sometimes, if we are honest, it has been. If we consider that the Enlightenment were leftist thinkers, it doesn't make really sense. But the right was the religious, aristocratic, theocratic, feudal, land-owning aristocracy, and the left were the bourgeoisie mostly. So in this sense, the Enlightenment, in a way, paradoxically, was a kind of a leftist movement, and Romanticism was kind of a right-wing movement, although it was folkish and even populist, one might say, with the modern terminology. But they were right-wing populists. I simplify, it's more complex, yeah. And that's why the modern right-wing people, in the sense of the middle class, I'm not talking about politicized people, but the people, the right-wing people, namely shopkeepers, entrepreneurs, the middle class, and the patriotic working class, one might say, plus some elites, vaguely. The right-wing people, in a way, most of the time in the modern West, is Christian. These are bourgeois families who have remained faithful to at least the formal aspect of Christianity. But they are the successful ones relative to the less successful people on the left. But there are very successful people on the left as well. But the middle class overall is more successful, at least economically, than the working class, obviously, but the underclass or the less privileged, or but these people, most of the time, they constitute the functioning cells of a decaying society. Western societies are decaying and declining, and the functioning units within these decaying societies are overwhelmingly, I'm not talking about individually, but those who make the economy function and work, these are mostly the right-wing people, which means patriotic working class plus middle class plus entrepreneurs. I simplify. Whereas on the left, there is the financial elite, the intellectual elite, partly the working class, either native or of immigrant origin or both, plus the civil servants and the underclass, partly native, partly of immigrant background. So economically, the right-wing people, if we divide the people sociologically in left versus right, there are very intelligent people on the left, obviously, because the intellectual elites are overwhelmingly on the left. The financial elites, sometimes even economic elites, for various reasons, they are on the left. But those who make the economy function, these are overwhelmingly people on the right, because the underclass, most civil servants, a lot of intellectual elites, and even partly financial elites, they can be very detrimental to the economic and social well-being. Those who make the society function, these are predominantly the right-wing people. It doesn't mean that they are politically on the right. But the bourgeoisie, the right-wing bourgeoisie, plus the middle class, basically, plus the patriotic workers. Yeah. So that's kind of the sociological divide in the modern West. In England, France, the US, each situation is different. In Germany, that's kind of different because really the working class is really on the right. In other countries as well, but each country has its specificity, but the broad tendency, that's kind of how it is in a way. I simplify. Yeah. And these people, overwhelmingly, they tend to be Christian, or if not, the overwhelming majority of people who are still Christian formally, they belong to these categories. I'm not sure that there are many Christians in the cosmopolitan elites, in the intellectual leftist elites, in the underclass. Maybe there is. Maybe there is in some countries like the US, or maybe they are formally Christian, but I'm not sure that they go to church or that they have a collective religious life, etc. Among the immigrant working class in Western Europe, they are predominantly Muslims. There are Christians as well from sub-Saharan Africa, but predominantly they are Muslim or non-affiliated or Catholic sometimes, like the Hispanics or Southern Europeans in Western Europe, or Hindu or Oriental religions, depending on where they come from, if they come from Asia, etc. The civil servants, they can be Christian, but usually the formal Christians are on the right. But precisely what I was talking about is that the spiritual Christian, in a sense, here it's kind of partly a criticism of Christianity from the Nietzschean perspective, namely those who want to overthrow society, to invert the relationship of power and put the weak at the top, and then to equalize by actually bringing down the successful. If we really simplify, that's the negative aspect of Christianity. Then in this sense, a lot of people on the left, although they are completely atheist or agnostic or indifferent to politics or to religion, they are Christians in this simplified Nietzschean critical perspective. And actually, that's why there is kind of a religious revival among the woke. It's not consciously a religion, but here I know vaguely about the history of the US. There have been religious revivals of all sorts throughout the centuries, a different form of Protestant or evangelical or various sorts of religious revivals. The Americans, they are, in the Anglo-Saxons and especially the Americans, they are a very moral people, and here moral is not in a sense of ethical, So it's not necessarily a praise, but they put a very strong emphasis onto morality. It's an Anglo-Saxon specificity, and especially in America, the need to build moral communities and to embrace a cause, to abolish slavery, to restore, to establish more equality between men and women, to help the civil rights movement, to help migrants, to help the transgender, the oppressed, the minorities, etc. It's a moral impulse. Kevin MacDonald talks about this, which has pervaded the modern world, especially the Anglo-Saxon sphere, especially the US. Moral communities, in the form sometimes of consciously religious revival and sometimes unconsciously, it can be atheist or agnostic, but it's nonetheless a moralistic impulse. Here it's not necessarily always a praise, because precisely morality can be moralistic without being ethical, and in this case Nietzsche was clear-minded. It's usually kind of deceptive. There is a spiritual need, but it's not always properly expressed there. But this tendency, the moralistic impulse of the Anglo-Saxons and the Americans, it can be for the good, of course, but it's a recurrent feature. And the modern form that it takes is what they call the woke ideology. So in a way, it's kind of a religious movement, even though, or in spite of, the fact that it's consciously atheist or not consciously religious in a classical sense, but precisely to understand the spiritual aspect, there is the form and the content, and there are a lot of formal Christians who are kind of spiritually dead, in a sense that they are just Christians because that's the tradition and it enables to build community life, but they are not very spiritually active. I'm not accusing them, but that's how it is. A lot of people, they are Christians because, well, it enables cohesion of the community, it gives meaning, but they are not really, well, it's, well, yeah. That's why politics, religion, economics, etc., art, philosophy, they are intertwined in a way. Yeah. Yeah. And the left, I've been thinking about this, they have this moral impulse, which the impulse is good. Most leftists, they want to do good, and they try to do good. And they try very hard to do good, and sometimes they succeed. I'm in a good mood. Historically, if we say that the Enlightenment is a leftist movement, it has been tremendously successful. But actually, giving the credit to the left would be kind of dishonest because, well, partly, but yeah. So there is the moral impulse is good. It's the moral impulse is always good, but the result and the way it is structured, historically, it has brought about disappointing or sometimes disastrous or sometimes dubious results. But it has to be acknowledged that there is this constant impulse towards morality. Yeah, the leftists, they need to be moral. there are right-wingers as well, but the right-wingers, if we divide in the realm of morality, the right-wingers, in a way, they would be more ethical and less moralistic, although they can be moralistic as well. There can be very annoying religious people on the right who think that they have the moral high ground because they feel self-righteous, etc., etc., etc. So there are ethical people on the left and moralistic. Here, moralistic is kind of derogatory in the Nietzschean sense, and ethical is kind of praise. So there are ethical people on the left and moralistic people in the negative sense on the right. But usually morality is more on the left. That's why they dominate culturally, intellectually, etc., because they have the moral high ground, because they always defend the cause which is supposed to help the greatest amount of people, so they always show off the greatest amount of compassion or virtue, etc. But the problem is that it's often inefficient or even detrimental or counterproductive. Yeah. Yeah, so what I wanted to say about the left is that if there were no problems, the leftists would invent problems just to have a reason to become activists, one might say. Yeah. I've already said it, but I've been reading the manifesto A New Liberty by Murray Rothbard briefly, and he talks about this basically. That's not how he formulates this, but basically the left, they always complain about the society in which they live, and the right always solves the problems that the left complains about, economic, political, etc. The right, most of the time, they solve the problems of the left. The example is capitalism was supposed to impoverish the working class. Actually, in the US and in the Western world, in the 1920s and even in the 1950s in Western Europe, but already before in the US, with the very high standards of living, the roaring 20s, of course, then there was the economic crisis, but the roaring 20s plus the prosperity after the Second World War, it had not impoverished the working class, it had made the working class of most Western countries very wealthy, and there was redistribution, but not statist redistribution. There was what they call the trickle-down effect. Basically, the poorest member of Western societies, they were becoming more and more wealthy, more and more well-off, because the economy was functioning, because it had adopted liberal principles all along the 19th century. They could accumulate capital, develop technology, innovation, skills, know-how, etc., etc. The economic, the capitalistic infrastructure which enabled to enhance productivity. So the workers were becoming more and more well-off materially. And that's when the left, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, they had nothing more to say about the economic aspect, because their model, whether in Russia or China, either it led to economic stagnation or humanitarian catastrophe or disaster or oppression. It was becoming widely known that it failed. Communism or socialism failed tremendously economically, but also anthropologically, politically in the USSR, in China, then Cuba, Vietnam, etc. It was more complicated because the hope maybe lasted longer, but actually it failed as well. Yeah, so communism failed. It was not very widespread because the USSR was very powerful technologically, militarily, in terms of influence, prestige after the Second World War, etc. But actually, communism failed. And it was becoming known, and yes, so the leftists, the intelligent one, they understood that they had been defeated. The right, if here right means capitalist, left means socialist, I simplify. The right had won overwhelmingly because they had provided good services, better living conditions, better standards of living, higher life expectancy, access to education, a better material prosperity like it had never seen before in the entire history of mankind for the greatest extension possible number of people within Western society. So leftists, they had to invent new problems, and they had acquired the luxury of caring about things which were less important, which are important as well, the well-being of minorities, either sexual minorities, ethnic minorities. Women are not a minority, but women, etc. Of course, to improve the restriction, the excesses of whatever oppressive political system. Of course, it can always be improved to a certain extent. The progress and improvement and a better life for the greatest amount of people has to be pursued to the most reasonable extent possible without causing too much disruption, of course. But actually, the right had won so overwhelmingly in the realm of economics, which had been the battleground for the past 150 years. Here, I think about the 1950s. So, for Industrial Revolution up until the 1950s, 60s, 70s, the main topic was economics, basically. With the Industrial Revolution, steam engine, etc., electricity, etc., mass production, industrialization, the car, the radio, steamship, modern plants, factories, mass production, development of technology, communication, etc., the capitalists had won economically. The working class no longer wanted to that's the story, but actually it's kind of correct. Of course, there were those who were not satisfied, but in the 1960s and 70s, the left, they completely inverted their criticism of Western society. They started to accuse capitalism of producing too much wealth and to blame consumer society and decadence brought about by consumption and the ecological crisis. So the right had solved the problem of poverty, oppression, lack of opportunity, which had burdened mankind for millennia, in a course of a few decades, with of course a lot of toil and effort, etc. But basically in 2 centuries, since the Enlightenment up until the mid 20th century, an overwhelming number of problems that had affected mankind for millennia had been solved, at least in the most developed parts of the world. So the left, they invented new problems: cultural criticism, ecological criticism, and the role and the situation of minorities, etc., etc. Yeah. So it's very difficult to be a right-winger, because not only if you are in a kind of an individualistic, in a good sense, perspective, you want to take care of your own life, to take care of your own business, not the economic aspect necessarily, but to lead your own life. So it's already difficult enough, but then you are burdened by the left in the West, who keeps posing problems that they expect you to solve. So you have to... That's why the right always loses, because the people on the right, they are too busy leading their own life, the entrepreneurs or the people with a family, they are too busy focusing on their own life to bother caring about the left who keeps complaining. They grant they grant to the left their requirements. Okay, you want more redistribution. Okay. You want more rights for women. Okay. You want more restrictions on whatever education, entrepreneurship, or whatever. Okay. You want more immigration, more tolerance, more diversity. Okay. The right wingers who control society economically, they keep granting all sorts of requirements. They keep fulfilling the requirements of the left, which keeps being more and more demanding, more all sorts of things. The right wingers, they say, okay, now leave me alone, I want to lead my life. Okay. Basically, that's how the bourgeois, not all right wingers are bourgeois, they are working class, right? But the bourgeois people, in a noble sense, who make society function, they keep saying yes to most of the insane leftist demands to keep them satisfied. But the leftists, they keep complaining all the time, and it can become a little bit annoying sometimes. Yeah. Well, okay. I just wanted to talk about the Enlightenment, Romanticism, Nietzsche, and Christianity. Yeah, that's what I intend to talk about. Yeah. I will stop the video here.